What content would you create if you thought like a broadcaster? This was a question I posed to listeners in episode 6 with Nick Francis, who's co-founder of Casual Films. As the world comes out of lockdown, we've joined forces to come up with a framework to help you reset your approach to creating content that engages people in a post-COVID world. Nick kindly invited me onto his own podcast, the Better Video podcast, last month to talk about the framework to help you change up your content.
Hello and welcome to the Better Video Podcast, the podcast that aims to make you a better commissioner and producer of branded content and business video. I'm Nick Francis, co-founder of Casual Films. We work with businesses all over the world from bases in the US, the UK and Amsterdam to help those businesses to achieve their goals with video. Today, I'm delighted to be joined once more by Chris Lacan-Harwood. Chris is a content marketing and social media strategist and the host of the Employer Content Marketing Pod. He spent much of the last 18 years helping businesses large and small to market, communicate and recruit more effectively. That experience makes him perfect for today's discussion. So Chris, how's it going?
Yeah, good thanks. Good thanks, Nick. Thanks for the invite again. It's always good to have a chat. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about what brands being broadcasters actually means, because that's a part of your book that you covered off, and we were chatting and thought today actually we'd join forces and talk about coming out of this kind of current crisis and how communicators can reassess their approach to content. And we've put our heads together and we've pulled together a bit of a framework that your listeners can go away with and start putting into action.
For sure. I mean, it does feel a bit like we are, if not through the virus completely, or even maybe, we've still got a bit of the rump left to go. We're starting to talk about reopening our societies and, phased reopenings. I think, obviously the world's going to be, fairly abnormal for some time to come. But, whether we go back to work on Monday coming or on some Monday in a couple of months' time, the fact is that the crisis that we've just been through will have really massive implications for the businesses that we've been working with, obviously, as Casual and for you as well, Chris. There's all sorts of different talk about, are we going to see a really significant bounce back? There was a very major bounce back after the 1918 flu. So, maybe while we might see, 40% fall in GDP this year, maybe next year we might be a jump of, 50, 60%. So, that could be really quite significant. I mean, I guess whatever happens, what has happened requires a slight change or at least a reassessment in the approach to the content that we're all sharing.
Definitely. I found that, it's since the pandemic, it's really been where brands have not been able to kind of push their product as much as they've been able to before. For a number of reasons, and for me that's quite a nice challenge to set, which is what does our content need to do if we are not focusing on the vacancies because there's been a recruitment freeze, for example. What do you do when you don't have that to say? And so I think that's where this kind of conversation has come from, really, is because in the episode that we did last on my pod, it was really saying, okay, well, if you're in a meeting room, talking to your talent attraction colleagues or your marketing colleagues, it's like, ask the question, what content would we produce if we were a broadcaster? And I really think when you ask yourself that question, there's a massive chance in your content being very, very different. So kind of wanted to kind of go back to really talking a bit about actually what being a broadcaster really means.
Yeah. So I guess in its most basic term, being a broadcaster, certainly in the way that I talk about it in the book, is your core product is the content that you produce. And I guess the reason why it's important for brands to have that mindset is that their content that they're sharing has the ability to build brand value in the same way that any other product that they produce does. So, if you're a luxury car manufacturer, you obviously take the cars that you produce extremely seriously. If you create, leather jackets or even mouse mats for people who are aficionados of your brand, they will assess those products by the same criteria that they assess. Maybe criteria is the wrong word, but they will, they all form part of the perception of your brand. So if you're producing high quality cars and you create a leather jacket that just falls apart, you're damaging the perception of your brand in the person who bought that jacket. Now, the fact is, as content marketers, we need to just be thinking, how is the content that we're sharing going to affect the perception of our brand, and how is it potentially going to be used to build brand value, or can it be used to build brand value? So if we're sort of thinking about, what kind of content should we be producing, I'd kind of bring it back to kind of the core principles of thinking, well, who are our audience? And, how do we make sure that we are creating content that maps onto, what their, desires and interests and motivations might be.
You talked about BBC, didn't you? When we've chatted before about how they approach things in terms of kind of being in it for the long game. Yeah,
and the idea that they're obviously the BBC think about this thing like this, but then all like major networks think about building a lifetime relationship, or certainly kind of traditional networks think about building a lifetime relationship with their audience. Now, that may be for someone like the BBC creating like kids TV to kind of hook kids in from an early age right through to all the different content that they create for you as you move through school and through university or secondary education or further education, and then into the workplace, and catering for all the different interests of all the different people. I guess obviously from a brand standpoint, you're not going to create that kind of breadth of content. You just couldn't possibly hope to. But if you can think about like what's your customer life cycle, who are the people who are going to work with you, who are the people who are going to buy your products, and how can you make sure that you're sharing content from as early in that process as possible to try and build their perception and brand value. Then I don't know. It's just it's a more positive way of talking about it. It's something when we were talking before, Chris, that you were sort of said that like if you can come at it from that mind frame, then you're going to then the content that you create is going to be different.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
No,
sorry. Well, I think it's it's this idea of like I go on about it endlessly, but like this idea of like what are you trying to achieve? It's like what's beginning with the end in mind.
Yes.
And if all you're trying to do is create a load of videos, then what you're going to end up with is a load of videos. But like if you're trying to build long-term brand value, like in the way that a broadcaster might, then your approach is different. And it was interesting when you mentioned that. It kind of did make me, it's interesting. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, I just think if you go back to this question of, what content would you produce if you were a broadcaster? I think that takes us into thinking about a bit of a framework. And I think this is something that, that your listeners can take away, and at very least kind of works as prompts that you can include in internal meetings that you've got, conversations you have with agencies, just to go, well, how could we reset? How should we reset our content? So this framework, I think, starts off with, I really do like to think audience first, and okay, it is about the audience, but I think often, companies do think about what they want to say first of all. And when you do that, naturally you're going to be talking about yourself than I suppose helping the audience. So the think audience first thing I think is really important. And, I've seen it a lot where this, when I think about your audience, and typically it's, okay, well, our audience are this age group with this experience, with this income, and in your book, I loved your example. I can picture it now, which is taking a demographic, and taking the demographic, and basically the two people. One was what? Ozzy Osbourne,
right? Yeah,
and the other one was Prince Charles.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Extremely different. Extremely different.
And just the danger of just focusing purely on demographics.
Yeah,
because they're both kind of multi-millionaires in their 60s who like dogs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's ultimately, if you're to behave like a broadcaster and use the kind of principles of content marketing, you've got to be adding kind of value to the audience by the thing of informing them, entertaining them, and kind of inspiring them through stories and advice. So I think looking at psychographics and those kind of needs and motivations of the audience is really, really important. And it's things like kind of personality traits of the individuals, or the values, or the attitudes, the interests, and the lifestyle that people have. These are things that need to be layered on top of demographics.
Just to really clarify that, when you talk about demographics, what, just for the audience to just be sort of clear, what?
Oh yeah, so age and gender, location, employment status, area of expertise, professional background. These are things that put people in particular, say, categories, but their values, attitudes, interests can be very, very different, which I think actually then leads, when there's too much focus on demographics, that leads to the issue of especially when it comes to employer marketing, leads to maybe the wrong people joining an organization. Organizations are ultimately like kind of tribes, communities of shared beliefs, shared values, and the way they approach work. So ultimately that's what is the brand, is an employer brand. So it's really important to kind of really look at those psychographics as on top of the demographics. Otherwise, you don't get the right people. And I can't remember the exact stat at the moment, but it's Gallup did the global workforce report, and a massive number, I think it was about 75% of people they'd researched globally said they were disengaged at work, which is massively detrimental to a business. And as I say in my podcast, in my kind of intro, is finding the right talent is the number one challenge facing businesses above everything else.
Completely. Because you get it right, and everything else just falls into place.
Exactly.
If you can get the right people, they solve all the other problems.
Exactly. And Branson talks about it, doesn't he? Although obviously there's loads of stuff going on with that at the moment with Virgin, but look after your employees.
Yeah,
he has, hasn't he? So the whole thing of look after your employees and your customers will be happy is something that feels a little bit awkward, but he's right. He's absolutely right. So I think that thing of think audience first is something that can seem quite obvious, but on top of the demographics, really look at those psychographics, talk to your
Yeah.
people. You've got employer brand research, that should have that. You would have had, conversations with focus groups, internal focus groups that will give you this kind of psychographic information and just build those personas. Now, if you have them, great. If you don't, just get into a room and start scribbling stuff on a wall. And at least you have a starting point that you can either just go with, use, or to take to, an agency or a partner to build out further. But just do something.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I almost feel a little bit like a broken record, just going on about audiences and focusing on what you're trying to achieve. But it's incredible how hard it can be to just be completely audience focused. It's very easy to say it. It's very easy to sit around a table and nod at it as a concept. It's a very different proposition to actually like really do it, and potentially to create content that the people who are holding the purse strings don't necessarily love, because it's the right thing to do for the audience. So
yeah, definitely. I think it's something that is worth spending time on. And I think when you kind of takes us to the next part of the framework, which is to kind of then look at, once you've got that audience first, stuff, that information to hand, then it's going, all right, well, let's look at our brand and what we stand for, and then a classic Venn diagram, whatever is the intersection is probably going to give you good guidance on what kind of stance you should have and what kind of content you should create. I particularly liked in your book, though, what you talked about, which I suppose is kind of the next part of this framework, which is creating true content. So what does that mean, Nick?
If you're sharing content, you want to make sure that it is providing as much value to your audience as possible. In the same way that if you're producing a product, you want it to provide as much value to your customers as you possibly can. Now, value can feel like a little bit of a sort of abstract term, and so just to help people to think about different ways that content can offer value to the audience, I quite like the mnemonic TRUE, which is TRUE, and that stands for timely. So if you can share a piece of content at the right time with the audience, I mean, that's a contextual thing, I guess, really. But yeah, if you can share just the right content at the right time, relevant, obviously it's essential. That goes back to kind of our sort of first step in the framework, that it has to be specifically relevant to that audience member. Useful. There's a huge amount of value in useful content, whether that is just like relatively simple how-tos or, sharing kind of the kind of content that people can use to maximize their lives, through like anything from kind of yoga to, as I mentioned, kind of product how-tos, recipes, that kind of thing. Hang on, I'm going to do that. Which is useful. So that is we see a huge amount of useful content on YouTube, and that could be anything from kind of a recipe to a training course to you name it, really. It's like, does it have like real use to that audience member? And then
actually, from an employer marketing perspective, you think about companies and the experience they have, the advice they can provide, especially from an early careers perspective, and also from an experienced professionals perspective. There's a lot of useful advice that can be provided, and I liked what you talked about in the book about was it Newsround at the BBC, and how actually that kind of brought things absolutely back to basics.
It's really interesting. It's that idea, that kind of little anecdote has kind of just so, I don't know, sort of call on it all the time, because it really reminds you just how important it is to boil down the information that you're sharing. And in a
Mm,
nutshell, when I was working at BBC Breakfast News, they did an audit of all of the different news outlets
mm,
that the BBC had at the time. So everything from the kind of big flagship nightly kind of late night news programs, like Newsnight, for people who know it, or like the Today program on the radio in the morning, which is like their sort of real kind of masthead programs, right through to Newsround, which is what kids. It's the sort of, it's designed for tweens, I guess, and
mm,
teenagers, and across all demographics, all age groups, the content, the news programs that got the most positive responses from the focus groups that they did up and down the UK was Newsround, and it's because, and this kind of, it's kind of relevant to the audience point as well, is that like news people are like just massive news geeks, like people who get really into listening to news and watching the news and reading the news have a huge depth of knowledge. And one of the problems is that anyone who is broadcasting news and is a reporter or correspondent is a news geek in themselves. They kind of have to
mm,
be, and they tend to just tailor their content to themselves. It's an
mm,
absolute fundamental trap that people fall into, and so that makes accessing the news as a sort of everyday audience member, who maybe isn't a kind of avid news follower, really challenging, because there isn't really an entry point where you can suddenly know, who the president of Syria is, or
mm.
whoever, because it's all assumed. It
Yeah.
assumes that the background to 9/11. It assumes and people don't.
Mm,
And that's just, it's a really valuable point for all communicators, really. Is like, keep it simple and make it accessible.
mm,
And you can, in a way, you can almost struggle to make things too accessible.
mm,
So yeah, and then finally, it's just he is entertaining.
mm,
Make content that entertains people, particularly at the minute. Like, there have been so many, like, how to work from home and how to look good on a webcam, and certainly at Casual, like, we've shared we've shared our fair share of those too.
mm,
But actually, the content that we've shared that's had the most resonance online has been the entertaining stuff, things
mm,
that are lighter. And I'd certainly recommend for brands like, um, another kind of random anecdote, but I remember talking to a producer who worked on The Hurt Locker, which
okay.
was a Catherine Bigelow film. It's a war film
Mm,
that won the Best Picture Oscar, and it's the lowest grossing Best Picture Oscar in history.
mm,
Um, and the reason for that is that people want escapism, and like, war films are just far too real and far too edgy. With all of the COVID stuff that's going on, people were looking for a bit of escapism. So,
mm.
why not provide it to them?
And entertainment can be various things, can't it? It can be something that makes people laugh. It can be something that can make people feel the other side of the emotions.
Yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely.
and it's important to do that because I think it's kind of about just being yourself as well. And if brands have certain values, then there will be certain things that they would naturally do when it comes to
Mm,
entertaining people. So why not do it? Um, so we've got timely, we've got relevant, we've got useful, and we've got entertaining. So
yes.
if if there's content that is ticking those boxes,
Hmm.
then you're doing a pretty good thing in terms of trying to reset your approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
And that's just, it's not really set in stone. It's a way of just trying to break down, like, what do you really mean by value, to the audience. And, you know, like just because something is relevant doesn't necessarily mean that it can't be useful. In fact, you know, though they all sort of work together. It's just a way of just like having a little think about how, what you're able to offer. What's the next step in the framework then?
It's really then about, you know, looking at how much content you can plan and produce in advance. I'm doing something with a client at the moment where we've basically batched up content that we know we're going to need to use over the next 8 weeks, possibly longer. So we've, you know, spent time and effort to actually, you know, produce that content in advance. So we have that say stack of content that we are now dipping into and putting into, you know, content schedules and, you know, and publishing, say particularly around on social. So I think, you know, there's things that businesses know they need to achieve, and they know that there's certain times of the year that maybe their audience need things. So just plan to that. Plan that and produce that in advance. So then actually when you have got something that maybe it's something that you didn't think of when you developed a strategy and go, oh, actually, you know what, that's something we could do. Or if something happens, you know, tapping into the timely side of things and relevant side of things is, oh, that's happened now. Let's be able to react to it. Now, if you're planning your content on a daily, weekly or monthly basis, you probably don't have the capacity to actually respond to that. So kind of give yourself a bit of a break, a bit of a breather, so to speak, by actually planning that content in advance. I know it's something obviously you guys at Casual do in terms of going, let's actually, when we're producing video, let's actually see what we can do in advance and making the most of the assets that you are creating.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the other point with that is just that like the production is the bit that costs the money. You know, and having people going out shooting like that, you know, that because you're paying people's day rates like that costs more money, you know, if you're taking that route, and it's far like incomparably more economical, and you'll get far more mileage out of the content you produce if you're able to think ahead a bit and lump, you know, maybe 30 different outputs out of, you know, a day or two's filming, than if you try and create it as you go. Now, I mean, the only thing I'd say about that is that like you want to be able to iterate. So like, of course you need to plan. Of course you want to create as much content as you can and look at like how you're going to share that through the life cycle of your campaign. But also social media and YouTube give us such an amazing opportunity to evolve what we're doing. And so, you know, you can put some videos out there, see what works, see what's resonating with your audience, what's getting your click-throughs, you know, or however you're judging the success of your campaign, and then just focus more on more content like that. You know, it used to be that you'd have to, you know, create a campaign, put it out there, and you didn't really know until it had gone off with a big bang and you'd spent all the budget whether or not it was going to be successful. Whereas now I think, you know, we have the opportunity to just start small and just like, you know, scale as we work through it.
Yeah, because there can be there is I think when you've got campaigns or projects, you know, there's naturally with projects there are, you know, there's a start and an end, and usually the end is defined by when there's a go live date, and there can be this thing about focusing too much on getting everything ready for go live, when actually, you know, you're not necessarily going to be putting all content out at the same time. So yeah, that point of view was about, you know, putting something out there to start with, and then doing something, you know, else off the back of the performance of that content. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other steps?
I think, I mean, it's the other kind of key step, I think, is just around going, well, look, you've spent time and effort actually creating this content. And if you're thinking about producing content like a broadcaster, then you've absolutely got to make sure the right people see that content. And so therefore, making sure that a part of your budget absolutely has money put aside for amplification. Okay, organic reach is something that is a lovely thing to have, but is decreasing. Although TikTok is showing that organic is certainly very much alive on that platform. But paying for content to be seen by the right people is absolutely important. So I think we talked about it in one of our episodes about the split between how much of a budget should be dedicated, or how much of a budget actually results in good performance. And was it a 75%, 25% split?
Yeah,
the content in favor of content over promotion.
Yeah, according to Google YouTube. Yeah. So getting the creative content right is absolutely essential, because otherwise you're just trying to push water uphill.
Exactly.
So let's just go, because I think there's a good framework there. We'll just go through those again. So step number 1, we want to think audience first.
Yeah, absolutely. Think audience first. And then, step number 2 would be aligning those audience needs with your brand, your proposition and values. And then we have the thing about making sure your content is thinking about true, timely, relevant, useful, and entertaining. Plan and produce that content in advance. You talked about starting small and scaling up. Iteration is really important. And then amplify as well. Make sure absolutely the right people are seeing your content.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a pretty good starting point. Just prompt to take into meetings.
Absolutely, and then just continue to iterate and amplify as you see successes. Yeah, great. So we're going to be sharing a webinar over the coming weeks on how you can pull some of these ideas together and make sure that you make a success of content marketing in the, I don't know, it sounds a bit kind of trite to say the new world, but the change world maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast, of course, the Better Video Podcast, but also to Chris's Employer Content Marketing Pod. You can find it anywhere you find and listen to your podcasts. And please take a moment to rate us as well, as that will help us to rank and really inspires us to go on to do more of these conversations into the future. We will be in touch about the webinar, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all there. Chris, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
Just thanks. Yeah, thanks for getting me involved again. It's great to chat, and looking forward to doing the other bits with you in the future.
Always good, Chris. Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe and sane. Sane just as important. And we hopefully will see you here again next week. Thanks for listening.